Senior Four Fellows, hello. It is a pleasure to be with you. Well, I guess physically not with you. Obviously, we are virtual. And honestly, right now at this exact moment, I'm probably sitting around a campfire with my fifth grader who, for some reason, his school decided to go on an overnight field trip. So look, if he was going, I was definitely going to be there. But I definitely wanted to be able to participate in the Senior Ford Fellows Conference. I really appreciate those who've organized this and put this together. You all are simply phenomenal, just like all four fellows are. But look, I really want to get into a serious topic that has all been plaguing us over the past couple of years, and for many of us even before that. And that is the multiple pandemics that we are facing, not just dealing with COVID-19, but also dealing with police brutality, and more broadly, dealing with systemic racism. So as you heard, I'm Rayshawn Ray. I'm a professor of sociology at the University of Maryland in College Park. I'm also the executive director of the Lab for Applied Social Science Research. We call it LASER. What we do at LASER is we take social science research and aim to connect it with policymakers. I'll be talking about some of that work today. I'm also a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, which is a think tank in Washington, D.C., and I'm a proud Ford Foundation alumnus from 2009 when I was a dissertation fellow. So look, getting right into it, part of the way that we are thinking about this moment is grappling with these multiple pandemics. And part of grappling with these multiple pandemics is the realization that early on during COVID, and still when we look at the trends to this day, is that Black people, as well as Latinos and Native Americans, American Indians, and Pacific Islanders are much more likely to have died from COVID-19. In fact, at one point in time, there were about over 21,000 more Black people on average than had died relative to white people. So in other words, if Blacks and whites had the same COVID-19 disparity rate in terms of mortality, there would be 21,000 fewer Black people dead, about 10,000 Latinos, about 1,000 indigenous people, and about 70 Pacific Islanders would still be alive to this day. So when we talk about the ramifications of COVID, obviously we can think about the impact that it's had. And part of this has been really trying to explain, particularly early on, why we saw Black people in particular dying at much higher rates from COVID-19. This is what a lot of my work is focused on over the years, is looking at racial health disparities, and particularly looking at the intersections of race, class, gender, health, politics, the criminal justice system, family, all of these things coming together in the way that I think about it as a sociologist. Simply put, one of the big things that I was asserting, as well as other scholars who are here, is that structural conditions undergird pre-existing health conditions. This is not about genetics. This is not about eating behavior. Instead, this is about the way that structural conditions govern our lives, the access that people have to different types of resources. And oftentimes, people living in predominantly Black or Latino neighborhoods have a lack of healthy food options, a lack of recreational spaces. They live in densely populated areas where social distancing is a privilege. We know early on that people started working in these essential jobs, these new essential jobs that give many of us the ability to order Instacart or have food delivered and stay at home and make brownies with our families, while other individuals are out sacrificing literally their physical bodies. And for individuals who live in densely populated areas, even more so, because we know early on, part of what was happening is that the public transportation system kind of came to a halt, or at the least it was limited. Part of what that meant, now you have more people piling on top of each other. We couple those things with individuals being less likely to have access to healthcare. And then even when they get that access, they are less likely to receive equitable healthcare. Oftentimes, Black people and Latinos are more likely to be spoken to instead of spoken with. And research documented that Black people were 6 times more likely than whites to be turned away from COVID-19 testing and treatment. And we know from California to Pennsylvania that first responders were tasked with deciding who should have the right to get to a hospital to get treated as hospital beds filled up. Part of this, obviously, is looking at the overrepresentation of low-income wage workers, not just Black workers, but also Latinos. When we look at Black people, we know that about 15% of frontline essential workers are Black. And when we look at low-wage frontline essential workers, about 20% are represented among Black people. It's a similar percentage for Latinos. Accordingly, we can look at occupations and simply follow occupations to know the pathway that COVID has taken, that certain occupations have had a much higher risk of people contracting COVID and dying from COVID-19. These are occupations that have had the highest mortality rate. If we look at before COVID to now, the mortality rates for these occupations have increased over 50%. Cooks, line workers in warehouses, agricultural workers, bakers, construction workers, overwhelmingly represented among Black and Latinos. And so part of this is looking at the way this plays out. We also know that even in our spaces, that the pandemic has had huge ramifications for people's mental health. We can look at from before COVID to during COVID, and we can see huge spikes in anxiety and depression. And of course, we've seen this a lot in our students and even in ourselves in the manifestations of acute mental health problems. So this begs the question, how do we reduce these gaps? What could we be doing better? This is what a lot of my work at Brookings, the policy work I do, has focused on, is testifying before the Pennsylvania State Senate, as well as Maryland, Virginia, also in Michigan, and then also at the federal level, helping to inform what is happening. Some of my recommendations include the importance of collecting comprehensive demographic data. You all know as Ford Fellows that collecting data is essential. This tells us what we should be doing. And oftentimes data tell us not only where we're getting things incorrect, but also where we're getting things correct so that we can actually replicate some of these things. Early on, I really pushed to ensure that we had COVID-19 testing and vaccination sites in Black and Latino neighborhoods, primarily by using churches and community centers. In the state of New York, Congressman Hakeem Jeffries and others put this in practice and instantly started putting testing facilities in Black and Latino communities, primarily in places of worship. And instantly we started to see changes there. In the state of Michigan, we conducted a large report looking at COVID-19 in Detroit and throughout the state. And part of some of the things we found is that these frontline workers, part of what was happening is they were going to work sick because they didn't have sick leave, because if they didn't go to work, they didn't get paid. So it's essential that people have paid sick leave, they have hazard pay, and then obviously they have a living wage. Part of this can also be done with universal health care, so that when people are sick, they can get the care they need and stay home and recover, and also not spread it to their loved ones, family members, and friends in their local communities. And then one of the other things we found with our large study in Detroit is that small business owners, particularly Black and Latino small business owners, as well as women, were cut out of the payment protection program funding from the Small Business Administration. In fact, during the first round, about 90% of Black small businesses were rejected, and a Stanford study found that over 40% of Black small businesses closed during COVID-19. I mean, these are just tragic numbers. Part of this, obviously, when we start talking about the vaccine, is how to overcome vaccine distrust. This is really important because we know this is rooted in the legacy and continuous impact of Tuskegee, of the Guatemalan syphilis study, of Henrietta Lacks, of a host of other examples that we could provide about why Black people in particular, as well as Latinos, are hesitant about the vaccine. The government oftentimes gives people little reason to trust it as an institution. But there are some things that can be done. Acknowledging that medical distrust is important. There's currently a new push to fully acknowledge Henrietta Lacks, whose HeLa cells set off a range of cures and vaccinations from everything from polio to dealing with cancers and the flu. It's time for her family to get the due that they actually deserve. Part of that means acknowledging that medical mistrust and making it right in a form of restorative justice. We also need to continue to be transparent about the vaccine, which I think for the most part has been happening. But of course, there's a lot of miscommunication, particularly on social media. Accordingly, we need effective social media messaging. Part of what that means is leveraging Black community gatekeepers and pillars in local communities to actually deal with the distrust that has been building up. This doesn't necessarily mean targeting famous people like athletes, which could be part of it, but it's more so about getting deep into communities, barbers, hairstylists, pastors, community leaders who work at community centers. These are the individuals where when people in these local communities see them getting the vaccine, they will be much more likely to do so. But we also know that there were some huge forms of inequality that manifested early on when the vaccine was being distributed. Part of this dealt with what Dr. Keon Gilbert and I called vaccine gerrymandering, where we saw from Detroit to Prince George's County, we saw people from outside of Black and Latino areas coming to those areas to get the vaccine before other people, before these frontline workers that are supposed to be there. These sort of things continue to erode trust in not only the government, but also in the process. A way to kind of deal with this is to really focus on what the problems were. Throughout states and localities, there have been different vaccine implementation plans. I think that the current administration is aimed to address this, but part of this has to center racial equity. Racial equity must be centered in this process, because when it is, then all of a sudden we get to equity, reciprocity, justice, and an anti-racism regime that can be applied to all forms of health. But instead, when it's not centered, we can see the ways that inequality continues to manifest itself. Part of this means not just thinking about race, but thinking about proxies for race. Zip code obviously becomes very important. We know that neighborhoods continue to be highly segregated compared to the past. There has kind of been a resegregating of sorts that has also followed the political system and the way that things are being redistricted, particularly with the new census that just came out. But accordingly, we can draw upon public health metrics from the Social Vulnerability Index to the Area Deprivation Index that captures geographic-based vulnerability and also measures neighborhood-level socioeconomic disadvantage using census tracts. These type of metrics allow us to focus on the people who are most marginalized to ensure that they get the resources they need, like some of the pushes that we've aimed to make in Detroit and other places like Baltimore, where they have mobile sites, where they're realizing that people don't have transportation. People can't even get to a site to get the vaccine or get tested. But instead, resources can actually come to them. These are some of the innovations that have been made. We also know, obviously, that early on during the pandemic, there was some worry for people about wearing masks, particularly among Black men. And of course, that was well-founded in some ways. It comes to fruition in how we think about police brutality. Most people know about the killing of Ahmaud Arbery, where now the McMichaels are awaiting trial for murder as he was running down the street, simply trying to go about his way, and all of a sudden got accosted by people supposedly trying to police and patrol their neighborhood. The older McMichael, of course, was a former police officer and actually worked for the prosecutor's office. And they found huge forms of corruption and conspiracy in trying to cover this up, very similarly to the sort of cover-ups that we would see over time dealing with lynchings and other sorts of murders. This really blends into how we think about police brutality, that it is one simple stat that has continued to reign through over the past couple of decades, and that is the fact that Black people are 3.5 times more likely than whites to be killed by police when they're not attacking and do not have a weapon. That's the bottom line. If you look at this graph, what it's actually showing, if you look at the middle bar, is that Blacks are about 2.5 times more likely. There's a recent report that just came out that I happened to get a preview for, showing the underestimation of how many people are killed by police. Definitely always known that. What's important to note here is that if you look at that second bar, Blacks are about 2.5 to 3 times more likely to be killed by the police relative to whites. But when you look at individuals who are not attacking and who don't have a weapon, and this is coming from the FBI data, some of the most conservative estimates we have that actually come from law enforcement, the gap increases. It does not decrease. In other words, it's not about the gun. It's not about what a person was doing. It is about the person's race. And race is the trigger that is increasing the police brutality that we see in the United States. Part of this is looking at a very troubling trend where well over 1,000 people are killed by police every single year. That is a person every 8 hours. A Black person is killed in the United States every 40 hours. So when we look at this totality, this is clearly an epidemic in terms of the way we look at it. It's not necessarily about violent crime. Besides the recent spikes dealing with COVID and a little increases around one of the previous elections, violent crime had been at an all-time low, but police killings still increased and kept going up. Accordingly, this graph doubles down on highlighting that it's not about violent crime. What you're seeing here are two different metrics. You see the police killing rate, which is in that reddish color, and then you see the violent crime rate, which are the blue X's. If police killings were about violent crime, you would actually see those X's align with the squares, but instead you don't. You see they are all over the place. In fact, the police killing rate is not related to the violent crime rate at all. If it was, in theory, that would make a lot of sense. Places where we see more crime experiences more police violence as a response to that. That is not what's happening. Instead, the police killing rate is primarily about policing Black people and also Latinos. However, white people are also have a high likelihood of being killed by the police in terms of raw numbers. This is clearly an epidemic that impacts all of us. Accordingly, when we start talking about the impact that this has on all of us, what we see is that these civilian payouts for police conduct that have been ruled as these payments going to family members because these killings were unjust, everyone from Walter Scott to Alton Sterling to Freddie Gray to Sandra Bland, and of course, one that I want to make sure you know about, Corinne Gaines, who's in the bottom right. You see her there with her kids. Corinne Gaines lived in Baltimore County, and she had been posting on Facebook, like literally live recording that she was being accosted by the police. They show up at her house to serve a warrant. After a few hours standoff, they bust up in the house. They shoot and kill her. She was holding her son, sitting in the kitchen. They also shot her son. Her son and her family was awarded more than $30 million in her wrongful death and the wrongful shooting of the 4-year-old. And just to tell you how warped our society can be, I was reading in the Baltimore Sun the next week after Corinne Gaines was killed. And it was telling out the story. And then it says, son expected to make a full recovery. And I thought, because at that time, my children were actually around that age. And I thought, wow, what world do we live in where a 4-year-old sees police bust up in his house, shoot and kill his mom, and shoot him, and we expect for him to make a full recovery? I mean, even if his physical wounds heal, his mental and emotional wounds never will. And I think that speaks to the lack of empathy when we start talking about what it deals with police killings. The other point is this: these dollar amounts you see, they don't come from police budgets. They come from taxpayer money. They come from the general pool. So if you live in one of these cities that I'm highlighting, or the many others where one of the nearly 18,000 law enforcement agencies are, when there is a police killing, when there is a use of force incident and there is a civilian payout, that money comes from your tax money that could be going toward education, could be going toward health, could be going toward work infrastructure, could be going toward social services. Interestingly, in well over 90% of these killings that I mentioned, these over 1,000 every single year, over 90% never is an officer charged, and even more rare is it that an officer is actually convicted of a crime. The Derek Chauvins actually become the exemplars that prove the rule of how rare that is, that it took him having nearly 20 police complaints, literally pulling over women who had recently had children, forcing them into the backseat of a police car and putting so much fear in them where they actually start lactating because they are breastfeeding and the baby is not around. And he says, oh, your shirt is wet. That's the kind of person that we're talking about. And it took him being on film, literally lynching George Floyd in broad daylight, to be convicted. We could also look at other incidents and play this out. But when we look at it in its totality, we are talking about millions upon millions of dollars paid out every single year for these civilian payouts, such as the ones like Breonna Taylor that people are starting to know about, and others. The $6 million from Tamir Rice's killing, the 12-year-old who was killed in under 3 seconds for playing with a toy gun in the park with his sister. So these are the sort of incidents that we're talking about. And some of the research I've done with some of my colleagues highlights that it's what we call the illness spillovers of lethal police violence. Shout out to Ali Sewell, another Ford fellow. And so part of thinking about this is these illness spillovers. What it leads to is if people live in neighborhoods that are over-policed, what it leads to is men's mental health suffering, higher rates of depression, higher rates of anxiety. And then for women, we actually see their physical health suffers. We see an increase in their blood pressure. They're more likely to be obese. And in the case of Erica Garner, who you see in this picture, who is Eric Garner's daughter, of course, he was in the chokehold saying, "I can't breathe," when he was literally killed by New York police. She died some years later, dealing with the stress of trying to fight for justice for her father. And look, oftentimes people like to say this is about implicit bias. Some of it is. But on the other hand, it's about explicit bias as well. And it's also about what I call structural implicit bias, where implicit bias is so deeply embedded in the organizational culture of policing that it leads to structurally imposed racial disparities. It's not simply about an officer being in a situation where they have to make a quick decision, because I think they have a very, very difficult job. This is about the ways that implicit bias is baked into the organizational structure throughout the process that leads to a lack of accountability to the community members that these individuals are solving. So look, I have been working on a large project with some colleagues in Laser, currently writing a book and a series of additional articles with my colleagues. And we have a lot of data on law enforcement, a large data set on Ferguson and Black Lives Matter, ethnographic observations where we were observing implicit bias trainings that we were conducting with police officers, and also a cadet recruit class. Over 100 interviews with police officers and community members, and then a virtual reality project where we've developed a virtual reality program to better train law enforcement officers to make better decisions. Some quick stats here. We know that Black people followed by Latinos are much more likely to be stopped by police. We know that even in places like Berkeley, where they've tried to do something about the racial gap in stops, when we look at the searches, we see who's much more likely to be searched, as you see here with the spike in the orange bar for Black people. We also know we go right across the bridge to Oakland, to Berkeley, where I did my postdoc at. And part of what we see is not only are people more likely to be stopped that are Black and Latino, but then again, they're more likely to be searched. Well, look, some people say, oh, well, that's just because they're more likely to commit crime. Well, a large study in New York City begs to differ, and as well as a study that recently mimicked this in Washington, D.C., showing that Black people followed by Latinos are disproportionately likely to be stopped by the police, they're disproportionately to be frisked by the police, and then they are disproportionately more likely to have force used upon them. In this study of nearly 700,000 police stops, over half of them resulted in frisk. You see that for Black people, nearly 80,000 had force used against them. Only 2% of all of these stops led to the discovery of contraband, a weapon, something else that was illegal, or an outstanding warrant. But that didn't stop them from being frisked. Why is that? Because stop and frisk isn't about finding things on people. It's about instilling fear in an entire community of people. One of the ways we try to address this is through implicit bias trainings with police officers. We put them through implicit association tests. We have them take social dominance scales. And some of these results pops out here that honestly was shocking to me, particularly among a very diverse group of police officers. We found that officers really hold much more bias against Black people and have perceptions that they are violent. Part of this is what I call when Blackness becomes weaponized. Again, even when Black people don't have a weapon, it's perceived that our physical bodies can cause harm. And what you see here It's not a mistake in the graph. This is what the results showed, that police officers were much more likely to have bias against Black people and perceptions of weapons than they pretty much don't have hardly any implicit associations between white people and weapons, even though whites are more likely to own guns in the United States. We see these sort of things playing out in some of the work that we've done, where we know that the same sort of physiological reaction people have to snakes and spiders, that visceral reaction that people get, is some of the same reactions people have to Black men in close proximity. And what it leads to are incidents like this, where this man has his hand on the gun and the officer is just telling him to calm down. But then on the other hand, imagine if that person was Black or Latino. Some of our interviews revealed, you can look at the gold spike and the green spike. And this is see what's so interesting about race, similar to the graphic I showed you before. Very diverse group of officers. Yes, are white officers more likely to hold implicit bias? Are they more likely to hold explicit anti-Black bias? They are. But Black officers are not immune from this either. And part of what you see here is that officers with more experience are much more likely to hold negative views about Black people and Black Lives Matter. How negative? Well, look at the top quote. I think Black Lives Matter, in my opinion, is a domestic terrorist organization, just like the KKK. I bet you know, and they are hell-bent on seeing the US burn. So we see the way that police officers make a comparison between Black Lives Matter and KKK. They don't juxtapose them and see them as different. They see them as the same of two sides of the same coin. What we did with our virtual reality program is we developed this program and we developed over 90 virtual reality scenarios, suspicious person scenes, pullover scenes, dealing with a series of other things, dealing with mental health. We immerse officers into this virtual world where they encounter sort of things that they do every single day. Some of the interesting things that we've seen and that we've actually found is not only can we examine their physiology, their heart rate, their stress, their eye contact, their body movement, their weapon movement. But some of the interesting things that we've actually found is that, of course, they exhibit anti-Black bias, but it's how this bias actually plays out that is really, really interesting. One of the things that we've actually found with this playing out is that the setting matters a lot. That when who the victim is and who the assailant is or is perceived to be is ambiguous, there's more anti-Black male bias. In other words, they discriminate more against Black men. But when officers know that, say, the person is a victim, say a clerk at a store, all of a sudden it leads to more equality, treating people the same. So in other words, if it's a suspicious person, or if it's a person at a home or around a home, that person becomes a threat if they're a Black male, more of a threat than white men, white women, and Black women as well. But we also find that officers speak more or less respectfully to Black people. So we see how these findings play a role. It complicates the issue. And we find that explicit bias plays a huge role in this process. So look, what do we do about it? Well, look, I've said a lot. I think there are a few things that are really important. First big thing is we need to create police department insurance policies. This is why doing something about qualified immunity, which is the court doctrine that protects police officers and other government officials from being able to be sued, we need to do something with that. The same way that Colorado's done something about it, and the same way that a few other places have done something about it. And in this place, we need police department insurance policies, as well as individual officer liability insurance. The same way that if a person is a plumber or is a lawyer or an electrician, they have insurance. Law enforcement officers should as well. This money should not fall on taxpayers when they keep making oftentimes purposeful mistakes. Accordingly, we need what I call a GAP program, good apple protections. That means that, look, I know a lot of great police officers. The problem is that they are baked into an unjust system. And part of what happens is the same way we talk about bad apples, to continue using that analogy, good apples get spoiled and they also get poisoned. They get poisoned by sometimes behaving like these bad apples. And then they also get spoiled by trying to change the system. And they're the ones who end up being attacked. like the large group of officers in Prince George's County who were either fired or demoted or transferred out, and recently won a large civil lawsuit against their own police department. So we have to protect those officers. I think we need state agencies to get it out of what's happening locally. We also need to reallocate funding. This is what people call defunding the police. Just to quickly give a brief on this, there are huge ranges in how much money is being allocated to law enforcement. If you go to a city like Oakland, it's nearly 40%. That mimics Chicago, that mimics Minneapolis. What are people getting on their rate of return for spending 40% of their tax money on law enforcement relative to around 25% in DC, 25% in Atlanta? A really good example is Arlington or either St. Paul, Minnesota, where we see the type of outcomes we want to see. But the reason why those departments aren't in the news is because oftentimes they aren't doing anything bad. And we need to play up the good actors, the good departments, and replicate them. Part of reallocating funding is about shifting money to social services, education and work infrastructure, mental health, which can also help police officers. And then finally, we need civilian representation on police misconduct boards. Part of what this means is it's not simply a board to be symbolic. Anytime a police chief gets excited about it, that means you're not pushing hard enough with these civilian oversight boards. And I've served on many and helped form them. The one to replicate is what's happening in Nashville, where they got funding from the city. They also have votes on the misconduct board within the police department to ensure equity, transparency, and accountability. And then they ensure that the type of justice is being served that they want. So look, in lieu of questions, the one thing that I'll say to 40s is that all of us are being pushed to do more than we've ever done before. And not to issue another challenge to 4 fellows, because I already think that we're going above and beyond. But part of this is a typology that I like to lay out about what it means to become a racial equity advocate, and also how to become a racial equity broker. When we become a racial equity broker, we literally start interrogating and changing the policies, rules, procedures, and regulations that are put in place that govern over us. And part of that interrogation means we go in, we figure out where they're inequitable, and we aim to change them, not just on our campuses, but also in our local communities, because our local communities oftentimes have been ran over by the universities that we're currently working in. And we're the ones that can actually be this bridge. So part of what I challenge you to do is to continue not only to try to thrive instead of just survive in the academy and also during these tumultuous times, but to live up to what it means to be a Ford Fellow, particularly a senior 40. And let's continue to lead, not only on our campus, but in our community. And let's set an example for other scholars coming behind us who are trying to figure out what they can do to make a difference. I testify regularly at the federal level and also at the state level. They need academics. They need our research. They need our knowledge. They need our ideas. One thing we know from John Lewis and Shirley Chisholm and others is if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. And as John Lewis said, once you get to the table, you got to make sure that you aren't on the menu, and instead that you're sitting at the table and go in the kitchen to pick out the ingredients to cook to serve people at that table, or else you end up being served. Because if you aren't necessarily sitting at the table to make up the menu, you're on someone else's menu and they're eating you for lunch. And for too long as academics, particularly academics who have traditionally marginalized backgrounds, that has been our process. And it is time for us to step up more and make a difference. So look, I'm challenging you the same way I challenge myself to make a difference through our public work, writing op-eds, speaking out more, also going to testify before Congress and in your state legislature. They need us. This is the place where our work is most needed. And we need to continue to stand up and do what we need to do. So look, I hope that you enjoy the conference. I hope that everything is great. And once again, I'm going to continue to sit by this campfire as this is going on with my 5th grader. And I hope that this has been useful for you. Thank you.